Hello, and welcome to Dark Hearts with Stacy Lee. Before we begin, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you want to support me. It helps so much. You can also join my Patreon. That helps keep the videos coming, and we are also in the midst of a fundraiser there, raising money for police departments. I will talk about that at the end of the video. Today's episode is on my playlist, Dark Stories, and it definitely belongs in that category. I think we are all painfully aware that our government is full of greedy, soulless vultures that wouldn't spit in your mouth if you were dying of thirst. I foresee a time, perhaps not in my lifetime, but a time where the 99% are going to rise up against the 1% and remind them who is actually in charge. It'll be a terrible thing when it happens because there will be a lot of suffering. But it's inevitable. Corporate greed is the thing that is killing America, not politicians. But because we are represented by a bunch of spineless weasels that don't stand up for us, nothing's being done about it. On either side. Our government doesn't care about us, and our government is capable of some very dark things. Sometimes its power is used against us, and sometimes it is used against those we are at war with. It's always nefarious, but even more so when those in power use the people's deeply held faith and beliefs against them. Are you listening? And you will see an example of that today. This is the very dark and disturbing story of Operation Wandering Soul. I'm your host, Stacy Lee. Let's begin. Our story begins in one of the most tumultuous times the world has ever seen. Here in America, when we think about the 1960s, a lot of times we think about muscle cars and movie stars and the birth of American culture. And for most, it's a time of prosperity. It's often very easy to forget that at that same time, we were entrenched in a 20-year war that ended up being one of the most costly, most ineffective failures in history. The Vietnam War began on November 1st, 1955, and didn't officially end until April 30th, 1975. I have personally heard a lot about this war. I have an uncle who was a Green Beret and fought for many years in Vietnam. When he returned, he was different. He's always been a little different, but I listened to my grandparents say he had changed. He's a bear of a man, and he likes to play rough with the little kids. One of the few times in my life I've ever seen my father truly angry was over a Thanksgiving holiday. This uncle was wrestling with the cousins, and as he did, his pant leg came up. And my father saw that he had a gun strapped to his ankle, and he was not happy to see that during playtime with the kids. There was kind of a hushed conversation, and my uncle went out to the car where I'm sure the gun was deposited. But people that fought in Vietnam, the course of their lives was changed forever. Every single one of them. My own father narrowly avoided combat only because he had just graduated from law school, and the JAG unit was in need of soldiers. The JAG unit is, of course, the Judge Advocate General, soldiers who are versed in the law. My father was drafted, but fortunately never saw actual combat because of his education. I have two grandfathers who fought in World War II and Korea. The grandfather who fought in World War II would never speak about the war at all. We were told not to ask him about the war. He was once sent home weighing 85 pounds. He had dysentery. As soon as he was better, they sent him back. My mother was born in 1945 while my grandfather was in basic training in California. So my grandmother took her as a newborn along with my aunt, her sister, on a train to say goodbye to my grandfather. My grandmother got her two little girls and loaded them onto a sleeper car, and in the little room they were assigned to was a chest of drawers. My grandmother wrapped her little newborn baby up, my mother, and placed her baby in one of those drawers to sleep in. They went to California and they said goodbye to my grandfather, not knowing if they would ever see him again. I have a brother-in-law and now a son-in-law who have fought in Afghanistan, South Africa. They've seen terrible things. I respect our military, but I despise war. It is pointless. It is detrimental to absolutely everyone it touches, and in the end, it solves little. The rich get richer and the poor get poorer, and all war does is widen that gap. Still, we fight. And in the years we fought in Vietnam, it was not always a fair fight. It was not even always a legal fight, and our government employed some very dark tactics to try and win this war. War is ugly, and this is an ugly story. First, we have to discuss the deeply held beliefs of the Vietnamese people, what the majority of those citizens believe. In that culture, it is believed that the dead must be buried in their homeland, on their home soil. If they are not, their soul will wander aimlessly in pain and suffering for all eternity. The Vietnamese believe that if a person is improperly buried or not buried at all, their soul will never rest. Not only will it never rest, it will always be in pain. The person will be lost, they will be confused, they will be constantly crying out for help. It's a terrible thought to think of someone you love or you yourself lost in the dark, alone, blind, crying out for all eternity. The Vietnamese people believe that when a person passes away, their life does not end. The afterlife simply begins. When someone passes away, the Vietnamese provide all of the things that their soul will need in the afterlife: food, clothing, money, cigarettes, and those items are brought to the funeral and buried with the deceased. The deceased in Vietnam are only buried after a period of time where the body is kept in the home. That time can range anywhere from 3 days up to a month. In more modern times, the time has become shorter, usually less than a week. The deceased is dressed in traditional white clothing and laid out for visitation. The dead person has rice placed in their mouth along with 3 coins, and then a chopstick is positioned between their teeth. Visitors light incense and prayers are said. It is common for guests to bring money and small gifts to the family during this period of time as well. The funeral is a multi-day event meant to usher the deceased into the afterlife. After the days of mourning, the white clothing everyone wears while mourning is burned. This symbolizes that the period of mourning is over. Many times a large tent will be set up in front of whatever building the family lives in to accommodate guests for the funeral. An altar will also be set up, and on that altar, photos of the deceased along with small offerings are placed. The body is then placed in a coffin and carried to its final resting place via a large truck-like hearse, which is usually decorated with very colorful symbols and flowers. Sometimes Vietnamese people prefer to be cremated, but most are buried. The final funeral procession begins before sunrise and involves traditional music. The soul of the dead is then sent off to the sound of crashing cymbals and trumpets. After that, every year on the day of the person's death, the family treats it as a holiday. The day is called Dem Gao, and family members come together to remember the deceased person. It's not a sad occasion. On the contrary, it's a celebration of that person and their life, and I think that's beautiful. I wish we had something like that here in the States for people who lose loved ones. Now, what I've just described is what happens to the very fortunate Vietnamese souls. It's very different for Vietnamese who may die, say, in a plane crash or overseas traveling, and for those who die in war off of their native soil. If the proper actions are not taken after a death, the Vietnamese believe that the person's ghost will remain on Earth, like I said earlier, lost, confused, in the dark, alone, and crying out for help. There are many Vietnamese that believe over time, those ghosts may even become angry. And when that happens, the ghost will return to haunt the family, bringing them bad luck and misery. This is all a very important part of the Vietnamese culture. The belief in ghosts is very, very real, and the belief in what happens to the spirit is deeply ingrained in this people. As the Vietnam War dragged on, the tactics became more and more barbaric. We all know that things went on in the Vietnam War that are absolutely horrific, much too graphic to talk about here, committed by soldiers on all sides of the conflict. Average men became monsters during this time period. There are stories of unthinkable things done to children and to women and to men. Soldiers did things over there and saw things over there that no human being should ever be exposed to. And as it continued, there was nothing more that anyone wanted than for it all to stop. The Viet Cong fought a guerrilla-style war. The U.S. was not versed in this style of warfare. The Viet Cong were masters at moving through the local terrain without sound and without being seen. They were teenagers, most of them, motivated by idealism, and they were not afraid to die. Those who weren't motivated by idealism had been shamed into joining the war. There was apparently a lot of pressure in that era on young men to join and fight for their country. The Viet Cong worried that they would not be able to stand up against the US soldiers, but they were on their homeland and they knew the territory better. Russia had begun supplying the Viet Cong with machine guns, rocket-propelled grenades, and recoilless rifles. The Viet Cong used booby traps and landmines, which were easy to make at home in their villages. They used scavenged tin cans and discarded wire, and even though it was junk, it was very effective when blown up. Then the American soldiers would engage in warfare from the air, and as they did, they would drop bombs, obviously, but some of those were duds. There are some numbers that say more than 20,000 tons of dud explosives were dropped in Vietnam. So the Viet Cong would gather those duds and rework them, turning them into working bombs. In 1965, Ho Chi Minh decided there would be a totally new approach. The Viet Cong would no longer engage with the Americans in usual battle. Vietnamese soldiers were instructed to perform hit-and-run attacks and ambushes only, sneaking up on American soldiers when they were at rest. This new tactic was successful and it was taking its toll on American troops. So our military leaders decided that because the Viet Cong had changed tactics, it was time for them to do the same. Now, for you history buffs, you know that this era in America was very much about the growth and acceptance of psychology as a science. It was a movement called the cognitive psychology movement. It was taking hold with a new approach. This new approach focused on a cognitive approach rather than a psychoanalysis and behaviorism approach. Cognitive psychology investigates mental processes like perception, memory, problem solving, things like that. While behavioral psychology simply observes the behavior of the patient and the way it impacts the patient and others around them. Now, I realize that's a very simplified take on it, a layperson's take. I am not a psychologist. Not only was the medical community jumping on board with this new movement, the government was as well. And we're going to cover the ways in which it did that. I'm sure you're all aware of the many experiments conducted by the CIA and other organizations during this time period. The military leaders had to come up with something different, a new way to fight the Viet Cong and these ambush-style attacks. And what they decided on is chilling. Our government decided to use the Vietcong soldiers' own deeply held spiritual beliefs against them. If the Vietnamese believed that dying outside your homeland causes your spirit to wander, lost, alone, and confused forever, they were going to turn that belief into reality. A dark idea began to form among some of the top leaders, and then they put their plan into action. They were going to conjure some ghosts in the jungle. Ghosts that would wail and cry and plead with the soldiers to turn back, to abandon their posts, and to run away from the war. The CIA brought in Vietnamese defectors and interviewed them. Leaders in the military learned about the Vietnamese beliefs and just how superstitious and fearful the Vietnamese people are about dying and not being properly buried, properly mourned. Our military leaders studied the culture and then they wrote a script. They brought in a Vietnamese actor. He recorded the script. They played it back for other Vietnamese people, and they said it needed work, so they reworked the script. They made it darker, spookier, sadder, more personal, and finally, they believed it was ready. I'm now going to play for you one of the actual recordings that was used against the Viet Cong. This is one of the tapes that was blasted from helicopters and from speakers left in the jungles, packed on soldiers' backs, with the goal of terrifying the Vietcong soldiers, scaring them so badly that they would abandon their posts. I would strongly suggest that you watch this part of the episode. I know a lot of you sometimes just listen to it while you're doing other things, but if you do that, you will not be able to understand what's being said. I'm going to type out the translation, so you'll need to watch this part. It's a pretty scary message. This is about 4 minutes long, which is longer than what I usually include as pre-recorded material, but I think it's well worth the time. It gets more and more chilling as it goes on.
tôi, vợ tôi, vợ tôi đang... Bà đang về với con. Tôi đã về với mình đây. Nhưng tôi còn đâu mảnh hàng nữa. Tôi đã chết rồi mà con đâu ở. Tôi hẳn không biết chừng nào. Các bạn của tôi trở về để nói cho các bạn biết rằng tôi đã chết. Nhớ phải, địa ngục, cái chết thật là oan uổng, thật là vô nghĩa. Nhưng lúc tôi biết thì đã quá muộn rồi. Các bạn còn sống, còn có ngày các bạn gặp được người thân yêu của các bạn không biết gì nữa. Trở về các bạn, muốn mau đi, dứt khoát mau đi, lừa bỏ đi các bạn. Nếu không thể tránh được cái chết cảm thương như tôi. Trở về đi các bạn ơi, để không thì quá muộn rồi, quá trễ rồi. Trở về đi, về đi các bạn ơi, về đi.
Look, I'm not a superstition person. I am not a religious person, but I don't think you have to be in order to, kind of have the hair on the back of your neck stand up. We're listening to it on the TV. Imagine you're out in the jungle in the middle of the night, in the middle of a war, far from home, with a very solid belief in ghosts and wandering spirits. You're a teenager who is already terrified of the war, and then you hear that. Let's talk a little about what we just heard. U.S. sound engineers spent weeks recording and altering the voices to sound more ghost-like. They wanted it to be as eerie as possible. The voice was meant to be that of a slain Vietcong soldier, killed in combat and full of regret. In the tape you heard, which is labeled Ghost Tape Number 10, sound engineers included traditional Buddhist funeral music and eerie background noises, along with a little girl's voice pleading, "Come home, Daddy," which I find especially cruel. I know these were our enemies at the time, but damn. And like I said, I hate war. I don't understand why we fight over imaginary lines in the sand. There are also voices of other men on the recordings, supposed other soldiers who died in battle, and those voices are telling the men, go home, reunite with your loved ones. They're pleading with the soldiers to avoid the same fate they met. The tapes were played over loudspeakers near Viet Cong encampments, but they were also played from helicopters hovering over Viet Cong camps at night in order to keep the soldiers from sleeping. Now, of course, in those instances, the Viet Cong knew the sounds were coming from the helicopter above, but the message was just as clear, and sometimes the U.S. helicopters flew overhead for days on end, interrupting the night and making it impossible for the Viet Cong soldiers to sleep. Then the U.S. began using boats to patrol up and down the river, playing the ghost tapes. The soldiers along the river were not aware that the helicopters were being used, and so many of them truly believed they were being haunted by the spirits of their fallen comrades. This is a photo of a PSYOP soldier carrying a loudspeaker on his back walking through the jungle. He is walking his entire journey with one of those ghost tapes blasting from the speaker on his back. Now, this was not a totally original idea. During World War II, the Germans used what they called ghost army recordings to trick the Allies into thinking the Germans had more Sherman tanks on the way than they actually did. The Germans would record the sounds the Sherman tanks made and then multiplied them over and over. Those recordings were played as the Germans approached for battle. I view that as more of a war technique. Yes, there's a psychological component to it, but it's more of a battleground tactic. Operation Wandering Soul was more of a capitalization on beliefs taking someone's personal and religious beliefs and turning them against them, which, again, I get that it's war. I'm not a total moron, but it's very, very anti-human. You know, I'm not a big proponent of religion, but I don't think you should take someone's faith and turn it against them as a weapon. So how effective was this technique? Well, as with a lot of things in war and the military, it depends on who you ask. The recordings played from the helicopters were not nearly as effective. Although the recordings did keep the soldiers awake, they weren't nearly as frightening, as the Vietcong soldiers obviously knew the sounds were simply a recording. However, there are reports from Vietcong soldiers that when the sounds came from the jungle and from the riverbanks, this tactic was very effective. There are stories that soldiers literally jumped up from their camps upon hearing the spine-tingling recordings and ran into the jungle, never to return. Did they make it home? Some did. We know this because there are reports of men returning to their villages with stories about the haunting voices in the jungles telling them to go home. I want to show you something else that I find disturbing. This is a death certificate for an NVA soldier who died at the age of 19, having joined the Army at age 17. He was the squad leader. The certificate has little detail of his death, just that he, quote, died in the Southern Front. This in Vietnam is considered a fate worse than death. There is no information on where this man died or how. There is no way for his family to mourn him properly because they do not know where or how he left this mortal coil. During a ceremony later conducted for men like this one, Vietnamese poet Nguyen Du wrote, quote, "Strangers have buried you in careless haste, no loved ones near, no friend, no proper rites, and under the wan moon, no kindly smoke of incense wreaths for you." Decades later, a reporter interviewed the sister of a fallen soldier, a boy of just 16 years old. An interpreter is there assisting, and the reporter asks, "What does she think of her brother now?" And the woman speaks. The translator replies, "She believes Hien is not at rest." She says, "I am now 54 years old and Hien has wandered for all the years I have been alive. I want to find him. I want to find his remains so he can be stable and at peace." Imagine what this woman and so many like her have been through, believing that for their entire lives, their loved one has been lost in the dark, wandering and calling out for them. I don't really know that I can think of things much worse than that. I always say if I had to choose, I mean, it's a terrible choice, but if I had to choose a loved one being murdered or missing, I'm choosing murdered when it comes to something like that, because at least you know. You don't lay in bed awake at night wondering if that person is chained up in a basement, hungry and hurt and abused and crying for help, crying out for you. And that is what these people have had to live with. And although it's not a belief I share, it's not something that I believe happened, they believe it's happening, and that's what matters. What makes this entire story even darker is that for many years, the government denied that it happened. Now, that seems laughable to me. There were probably thousands of US soldiers who saw it happening firsthand, who participated in it firsthand. And you talk about gaslighting. Damn. The government makes people do things and then tells them that those things didn't happen. The things that these soldiers went through are disturbing and upsetting. First off, to have to partake in some of these acts and then to have the government deny that they happened, that ain't right. Again, I get it, wartime rules, but those rules shouldn't include lying about what the soldiers saw with their own eyes, you know? There's a quote by Albert Einstein that chills me every time I hear it. I first heard it in a documentary and it's come up a couple of other times in things that I watch. But he said, "I know not with what weapons World War III will be fought, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones." Obviously he means World War III will destroy the world, and if people survive, if any of us survive, we'll be back to the Stone Age. And right now, in spring of 2024, it ain't good. Our government's worried about shutting down TikTok while we're like this close to World War III with Russia. I also love the quote that says, "War does not determine who is right, only who is left, only who remains." Wouldn't it be something if we could learn to stop fighting over an imaginary line in the sand, over whose God is the most powerful, over whose people are suffering the most or the least? Wouldn't it just be something if we could learn to stop fighting? Thank you for joining me today on Dark Hearts with Stacy Lee. Please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel if you want to support me. You can also join my Patreon, and that keeps the videos coming. You don't have to donate 20 bucks a month. Donate $1, and then you can become part of the fundraiser. This is the thumbnail for the video on my channel that explains all about the fundraiser. We are raising money to donate to police departments that have cold case DNA in storage that has never been tested. There are thousands of sexual assault kits sitting in refrigeration that have never been tested. They cost between $500 and $750 each. We want to raise that money, vote on a case, pick that case, get that DNA tested, and maybe solve a crime. The other thing that happens is we get that perpetrator's DNA in the system forever, and if they've committed other crimes, we might tie them to those. Our community is growing, and I couldn't be happier about that. I really appreciate everything that you guys teach me and all of the input and feedback that I get. Stay safe, my friends, and be kind to each other, and I will see you next time on Dark Hearts with Stacy Lee. Bye.